Director of the Center for Urban and Community Research at Goldsmiths College at the University of London. And he's a former colleague of mine from Goldsmiths, and we actually studied with the same supervisor at Oxford, so it's really nice that Michael's here today. His research interest focuses on issues of representation in the city in relation to urban policy, race and racism, and issues of policing. His publications include a book called Race, Riots and Policing, Law and Disorder in a Multi-Racist Society, which was published by UCL. And he edited a collection of essays called Place and the Politics of Identity from Routledge, Racism, the City and the State, also from Routledge, and Hallowed Promises, Rhetoric and the Reality of the Inner City by Castles in 1990. He edited with Stephen Pyle Geographies of Resistance from Routledge in 1997, which was an important book in social and cultural geography. He's also, among many other things, the co-director of the Deptford City Challenge project in the southeastern part of London. He's doing major research projects and development projects in China. He was also, as you'll see in the presentation, I'm sure today, the head of Tower Hamlets, the Labour head of Tower Hamlets, which is in the eastern part of London. So Michael will speak today. The title of his talk is Geopolitics on the Street, Transnationalism, the Political Imagery, and a Personal Account of Contemporary London Elections.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for the invitation. Just to introduce the talk itself, Charles asked me today to talk a little bit about what's been happening in London from a biographical perspective, which is why this isn't a straightforward academic paper. It's a paper that is, if you like, a collision between one part of my life, which is my political career, and another part of my life, which is an academic career. And if you like, the academic interests are the shadow throughout the story that I'm going to tell over about 40 minutes. To give you a little bit of background to the political context which I'm talking about is that in London, one part of London immediately to the east. London has 32 boroughs. Each borough is responsible for schooling, for planning, for development, for health, has a degree of control over policing. It represents roughly about £1 billion a year organisation. That's about $2 billion a year. And of those 32 boroughs, the borough I was responsible for 5 years and was a representative of for 12 years in various other roles, is the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, immediately to the east of the City of London. It runs from Whitechapel, Brick Lane, the old Jewish ghetto of London, through across to the River Lee, where interestingly the first version of segregation in London people don't talk about very often. The first model of apartheid was when King Alfred recaptured the city from the Danes, and the Danes were banished to the east of the River Lee. So on one side you had the Danes, and the other side you had the Angles, as was. But it contains both the New Docklands, the financial district on the Isle of Dogs, which has now is the second largest financial district in Europe in its own terms, has about 100,000, getting on for 150,000 jobs in the financial services. It also contains some of the most broke parts of the United Kingdom, some of the most intense concentrations of poverty. It's remarkable both for its forms and history of exclusion, but also for the moments at which those forms of exclusion have been challenged. Historically, the East End is where Oswald Mosley from the British Union of Fascists chose to march in the 1930s. It's also where communities of difference came together, Irish, Jewish, Caribbean, among others, among many others actually, to oppose Mosley. And Mosley's march through Cable Street was famously turned away under the slogan, "They shall not pass." It's the place where in the 1980s the first far-right fascist councillor from the British National Party was elected in 1993, the first successful representation of that in democratic electoral politics of the British National Party. But it's also where, again, a coalition of Bangladeshi white Jewish, Christian, Islamic groups came together to reject the presence of the British National Party. So it is a site historically of both moments of great despair and moments of transcendence of that despair. And I guess part of the context I wanted to talk about today is one where, if you like, to give away the strapline and then hopefully justify it a little bit, it's one where I think it is important to understand the genesis, the genealogy, the cartography, the maps, the routes of forms of intolerance that cross a variety of religious faiths, that include anti-Semitism, that include forms of Islamophobia, that include forms of faith hate that cross just about each religion, and to understand where they're coming from, but also to understand those political imaginaries in the context of other geopolitics. And so part of the point I'm trying to make, I guess, is that we need a quite careful scrutiny of the genesis of forms of intolerance in order to neither oversimplify their production, nor, if you like, reproduce sometimes their binary and simplistic Manichaean, Schmittian thinking in particular ways. However, I wanted to start the talk. There's a reality show on which covers most endemol production, sell it to most countries in the world. I don't think they've yet sold it to the USA, so I assume many people will not have heard of it. It's a program called Big Brother. Big Brother is a reality TV show where people are confined to a house for a period of a few weeks or a month or 2 months in some cases, and then all of their movements are scrutinized. It's a fairly horrific form of entertainment. It started in the Netherlands, it crosses, there are versions of this in Australia, in Brazil, in most countries in the world. One version of it in the United Kingdom is a version of Celebrity Big Brother. George Galloway, a politician. Could I just ask, how many people here have heard of George Galloway? I'll explain Mr. Galloway in a little bit more detail. Galloway is somebody who was a politician on the Labour left, who sometimes was on the Labour right, came out of a Scottish context which was marked by a particular politics in the Scottish Labour Party around tensions between Catholic and Protestant, interestingly, but also was involved in the early stages of an NGO called War on Want that he ran, and was involved in a policy around War on Want and the finances of it before he became a controversial MP. He left the Labour Party, was expelled from the Labour Party due to his position on his response to the Iraq War, principally, but also after a history of disputes with the party. He has been identified and alleged to have been a recipient of benefits from the sanctions oil money. Again, that's hotly contested and subject to legal dispute. But in the United Kingdom, he's most famous because he became an MP in the East End of London in the 2005 government elections, when he ousted Una King, one of only 2 black British members of Parliament in the Bethnal Green and Bow constituency in Tower Hamlets in London, which was one of the safest seats for the Labour Party. And Galloway fought that seat as a member of a new party, Respect, which I'm going to be talking a little bit about during the course of this discussion. Galloway is the extraordinary character that I could talk about at length, although carefully, since I'm currently being sued by him, as a number of other people actually. But he is somebody who has a particular profile, but he is, if you like, background to, but not absolutely central to the story that I want to discuss. The reason for the leaflet was because on May the 4th, last year, May the 4th, 2006, on the night before a set of local elections, I found myself the subject of some dispute about this particular leaflet. Mr. Galloway, this character here, had joining Big Brother house in the celebrity version. It became kind of famous in the end. What happens in this particular reality TV program is that the intensity of publicity tends to build up as the participants in the program don't realise that they're being subjected to a set of almost Pavlovian or Skinnerian tests of the way that they might behave. So recently, again, people in the room may not have been aware of this, but there was the version this year, the 2007 version of the Celebrity Big Brother show, involved a Bollywood star, Shilpa Shetty, who was subjected to racist abuse of fairly poisonous kind by some of the other participants in the show. It was then beamed across Britain, but then became a matter of global significance as her abuse became significant in India. Gordon Brown, the probable next Prime Minister, probable successor to Tony Blair, was visiting India at the time, had to apologise to the Indian nation as the presence on this reality show of a Bollywood star, and her abuse became quite literally a matter of international tension between the United Kingdom and India. So that the translation of a scandal at national level into a matter of global significance came through the television set. In Galloway's case, he was famously behaved in a way where he was seen to be performing as a cat, and in the reality show, and sipping milk from the hands of a woman, but also in this case dressing up in a leotard and dancing with somebody who's famously a transvestite. The reason that I start with the leaflet, though, is because on May the 4th, to my surprise, at about midnight on the day before the elections, some of the people were trying to distribute this leaflet, which was obviously not, by American standards, a relatively mild leaflet, I guess, but drew attention to Mr. Galloway's history, but also in the context of 3 candidates from his party, the Life. And as a result of distributing that leaflet, I found myself trying to negotiate with some representatives of Islamic Forum Europe, who are one particular body that I'll come back to in the discussion, but who were suggesting that this representation was itself a form of profanity. And the surreal nature of the conversation was that they were holding at, or some friends of theirs, again, I choose my words carefully, held at knife point people who were distributing the leaflet, and we had a slightly surreal debate at about 12 o'clock, 12:30 in the back streets of the East End of London about whether it was possible or not to distribute this leaflet, with the suggestion being that it would be all right if the leaflet was distributed with the figures in the bottom half cut off and the top half being distributed, but not with the implication that the profanity of the cross-dressing spread to the people below. And I suppose what I want to try and do is try and make sense of exactly what was going on in that slightly bizarre, slightly surreal, frankly slightly frightening moment, in the context of these 5 moments of collision, in order to try and explain to you, I guess, the ways in which forms of Islamism and forms of Islamophobia sit alongside old histories of multiculturalism and a Jewish presence in East London, and new forms of anti-Semitism, in ways in which I think the nature of the multicultural settlement of the city and the ways in which multiculturalism is realised in London is changing very rapidly. And if we're to understand this change, I think we need to understand the ways in which forms of imaginary community spread themselves globally in a way in the 21st century that is new. We have to understand the processes by which these forms of global sentiment actually are generated, but sit alongside forms of national rational organisation of political political parties. But also, we need to then understand both the pitfalls they represent, but also not exaggerate their ideological power or underestimate the fact that they are contested on the ground. And I want to try and say this by running through a little bit of the background to how that leaflet came to be possible. How it came to be possible that people would be held at knife point for distributing that leaflet at this time last year. And the starting point, if anyone wants copies of the PowerPoint, I'm just going to run through a little bit about how the city, multiculturalism appears in the city, and in particular how it appears in London. But think about the ways in which there is a tension between what I'm going to describe as the liberal and the communitarian notions of political organisation, of ethical organisation of the city, before coming back to the ways in which a new politics is emerging in Britain, which I don't think is particularly unique to Britain, which is simultaneously both highly local in its realisations, whilst being strikingly global in its political imaginaries. In other words, if we can understand the interplay between the global and the local, some people describe as the globalization of politics, can we begin to understand how new forms of intolerance emerge, as well as new political campaigns that try and address that intolerance. And in part, I'm afraid I'm only going to be able to signal some of my interests academically. But what the book, After the Cosmopolitan, that Charles kindly mentioned at the beginning of the talk, tries to discuss is the ways in which tensions between theories of liberal subjects, theories of liberal politics, and theories of community politics, theories of communitarian politics, actually create certain kinds of tension in the ways in which we think about multiculturalism today, the way we think about the new forms of diversity in the city today. And that if we're to make sense of those new forms of multiculturalism, we have to understand both the way in which the past haunts the present, but also forms of future vision equally inflect the present. And likewise, how actually we need to understand that the city itself is thought of almost as a map, in a way which either naturalizes difference, the mosaic, the notion that the city exists as a mosaic of different ethnic pieces, or alternatively, the city might be, if not a melting pot, the sites in which forms of cultures come together and create new forms of the hybrid, the novel, the sorts of invention that are at the heart of a different kind of dynamism. And so these tensions that come out of the spatialization of the city, as well as the histories of the city, actually might make us, again, think slightly differently about where intolerance comes from and where it might be going to. In a full realization of the two quotes, I won't go through both of them, but the one in particular, Amos Oz's point that there is a tension between peace and justice. Peace requires compromises, where justice detests them. And I suppose what I'm trying to do is begin to get to a point where we think a little bit more carefully about what is going on in forms of rhetorics of nationalism I'm highly suspicious of, rhetorics of Islamophobia, which are undoubtedly growing in the context of contemporary United Kingdom, but also the forms of anti-Semitism that have emerged more recently on the ground. And in part of doing this, and again this may be may or may not be of interest to people here, I hope it's some, but one of the things that interests me is returning. Benedict Anderson's famous book, Imagined Communities, has been reissued quite recently, tail end of last year, with a new afterword by Benedict Anderson. But it's one of the, for those people who don't know the work, it's one of the defining pieces of work that looks at the history of nationalism. And it is part of that work, what Benedict Anderson tries to do, is to understand where sentiments of nationalism come from, how they become particularly strong in the late 19th century, and dominate the 20th century, and they're almost naturalized in the 20th century as a normal way of organizing society. The nation rests, as we know, on invented traditions. When you begin to look at it a little bit more carefully, there is work by people like Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger that looked at the ways in which most flags, most national anthems, most stamps all kind of emerge as symbols of nationhood, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but are themselves not natural phenomena that have existed there forever, but are actually products of particular historical moments. And Anderson's logic in his work, importantly, I think, was, and this is a quote from the original, that a sense that at the heart of the imagining of the nation was a corollary dissipation of religious affiliation, and that sense of, if you like, transition, permanence through time, which Benedict Anderson in his work identified very much with print and the rise of popular literacy, gave a sense of the nation giving purpose, of humanity perpetuating itself through time in a way which displaced and followed on from Anderson's, in writing in the late 70s, early 80s, suspected disappearance of religious faith. As the quote says, with the ebbing of religious belief, the suffering which belief in part composed did not disappear. Disintegration of paradise. Nothing makes fatality more arbitrary. Absurdity of salvation. Nothing makes another style of continuity more necessary. What then was required was a secular transformation of fatality into continuity, contingency into meaning. It's actually a very beautifully written book. I think it's wrong in lots of ways, and for an interesting discussion about Benedict Anderson's book. But the notion was that the imaginary that was at the heart of the nation was in part about the displacing of religious belief. And it seems T.J. Clarke, the largely art historian, has written in revisiting the notion of political imaginaries in 2007 and thinking about Anderson's work 24 years on, has actually tried to make the point that what has happened is not that seemingly straightforward enlightenment succession of the national imaginary and the disappearance of a religious imaginary. But in fact, as it says in the quote, a rejigging of the balance of the forces between nation and ummah, nation and congregation, nation and jihad, nation and the chosen people. And although this is most commonly identified with Islam, it cannot be reduced to Islam, but we need to think about the emergence of new forms of transnational political imaginary and how they are realized in particular local settings. He also tries to develop a notion that what he described, whereas Benedict Anderson has identified print capitalism with the national imaginary, popular literacy with the sense of a national imaginary, that there was a sense of screen capitalism that actually translates a new technology of the global, and that this is part of a sense of a new kind of diasporic sensibility.
The internet, satellite TV,
absolutely, and it is in a context where I'm going to jump through some of this because otherwise I'll run out of time. But I think this is in a context where I guess we are bombarded by new forms of representation of the global present. But also those new forms are mediated in particular sorts of ways. So in the United Kingdom, and I guess in many other contexts, there is a shift from broadcasting to narrowcasting in many ways. One of the ways in which the political elections of 2005 were contested in East London were through very different media. So very explicitly, as a leader of the council, I would appear in front of the white English press, which covered an audience speaking in English, but I would also have press conferences with the Bangladeshi press and on Bangladeshi TV stations. There are 2 TV stations which are Bangladeshi and broadcast exclusively to a Bangladeshi subscription audience. The demography of the East End, the area where I was talking about Tower Hamlets, is a population of about 200,000 people. About 51% of that population is of non-white background, and that 51% is largely Bangladeshi. They're not entirely. There's a very old African Caribbean community that dates back from the old docks, as well as an old Somali community that dates back 100 years. It's also that part of London covers the original Chinatown, the first Chinatown in the globe, the opium dens you'll find in a lot of Victorian novels and Dickensian descriptions of London and Limehouse in particular. But in today's East End, it is one where whiteness, the whiteness of the 47, 48, 49% of the non-visible minority population is itself embossed with particular historical trajectories. And in particular, the historical trajectories of what is sometimes described as Catholic Wapping and Jewish Stepping. The area around the docks themselves were built largely by Irish migrants in the late 19th century. And it is still the case that parts of those old dockland areas on the Feast of the Virgin Mary on August 15th, there's a beating of the bounds of Catholic Wapping, even though that area is so gentrified that you now have flats there owned by Cher, by Rod Stewart, by famous soccer players, and even Helen Mirren, who's up for an Oscar in a few weeks, bought an old council house for £1 million just a couple of years ago, $2 million. To the north of the highway, you have the residuum of the old Jewish community, but again, one diminishing fairly rapidly in terms of age, in terms of people moving out of the area. But in terms of a visible environment, still a number of synagogues present, still a very kind of clear historical trace of what used to be, as I say, the old ghetto. And I think what I'm trying to suggest is if we're thinking about the complexities of those old historical landscapes sit alongside this new mediated globalization of different kinds of global struggle. And I won't go into detail about the overhead, but there is a sense in which the kind of over saturation of images, of stories, of press, of TV, of internet, create a different kind of problem that actually echoes a very old problem from the late 19th, early 20th century, which is how do you edit down that excess of images and information into something that makes sense? And George Simmel, when he was writing about the city in the late 19th century, used to describe that process of editing down as at the heart of a certain form of rationalization, of rationality. So, and in a sense, what I want to try and suggest is that the notion of the city that sits is an old map of London, a famous map that from Nicholas Abercrombie in the 1940s, that you kind of define the little blobs of communities and as the city as existing as these sets of tight little geographical communities existing one alongside another implies a particularly strongly communitarian vision of the city itself. But it's one that has a value at one level. It's not one I want to just kind of discredit or discard, but this particular kind of version of the communitarian, the known parts of the city that are made up by their small pieces, actually valorizes some things. It values some things and discredits other things. It values a particular sense of the local, the known, and the things that we hold dear to us. But it also actually tends to value the past. And there is a different kind of scholarship, a different kind of politics that has tended to suggest that kind of valuing of the past might be problematic. Hannah Arendt, the famous scholar around the public sphere and public debate, that actually talked about the importance of the present and the journey human beings need to take to become adults, to be free of memory's chains, to live now. So the point that I'm trying to make is that within traditions of political thought, there are very different takes on the extent to which we value the local or value the historical. Precisely because for some people, valuing the local and valuing the historical is about recognizing where you have come from. But for others, that there is a way in which that obstructs the way to create new political presence and possible political futures. And what I'm trying to suggest is that in a very, very multicultural, dynamic part of the world, such as inner East London, that actually inflects the relationship between communities of migrant settlement and their histories and their geographies globally in slightly different ways in 2007 than it did when we were thinking about cities in the 20th century. I'm going to skip this actually, because what I want to try to do is just give you a little bit of a sense of what happened in East London in 2005. Una King was is a friend, a Labour member of Parliament whose mother is Jewish, but her uncle is Tom Stoppard, the playwright, some of you may know. Her dad is Preston King, who's an African-American political scientist, and she was one of the first 2 British black MPs in the House of Commons in Westminster. And she sat in the House of Commons for 2 terms, from 1997 to 2005. She was, kind of, without going into a huge amount of detail, she was well known as somebody who was intelligent, sharp, photogenic, predicted to go very far politically. She tended to blot her political copybook by actually opposing the government around certain immigration legislation in its first term, from 1997 to 2001. But as one of only 2 British black MPs, she had a particularly high profile media presence. And controversially, and I have to say, I personally disagree quite strongly, she supported the invasion of Iraq publicly on grounds that were consistent with positions she had taken historically. And so much of what I say, I assume on several things I assume that I will say I will disagree with some people in this room and agree with others maybe, but I personally was strongly opposed to the invasion of Iraq. But Una came out publicly in favour of the Iraqi invasion and therefore became a subject of a particularly intense political debate at a local level. Her constituency was majority Bangladeshi, and her support for the invasion of Iraq became a matter of major political substance. And in particular, she was subjected to a growing amount of abuse about it. That was what led up to Mr. Galloway actually standing and creating a new political party initially in East London known as Respect, which drew together broadly the Socialist Workers' Party that stands to the left of the Labour Party, along with a number of groups that were broadly associated with a particular strand of Islamic politics in contemporary London. And it's an important marriage of different forces. And what happened in the end was that in the 2005 campaign, the national campaign, there was one of the most vicious political campaigns that had been seen in the United Kingdom over the last 15-20 years. A lot of very strong personalities, having been involved in politics in that part of London for over 20 years. I'd never actually seen anything as poisonous since the late 1980s, when the British National Party, the fascist party, were last strongly active. Una's identity, which was always important, and I think this is an important distinction to make, it had always been important, the fact that she was in a largely Bangladeshi part of London, that she was not Bangladeshi. So there had always been a strand of race politics about her identity, about the non-Bangladeshiness of her politics. But in ways that were quite disturbing to see at the time.
When she was elected, was it with a large majority?
It was with a large majority, although with a reduced majority on her predecessor, because there had been a debate about whether there should be a Bangladeshi MP in 1997. And so it was an issue that she was a black British woman who had been elected in that Bangladeshi area. But what became commonplace in the campaign in 2005 was a number of attacks on her personally as being both black and Jewish. And there was a series of kind of recorded incidents, and she's written about this herself, so I don't want to go into any great detail, but having been present on a number of occasions, there was a sense in which, you know, she used the language that she was told to fuck off, black Jewish bitch, and a lot of very nasty and quite increasingly kind of populist attacks on her identity, which hadn't been part of the various kind of ups and downs of local politics to the extent that had been common. And what I just want to do is the second of the 5 moments of, if you like, politics in the East End that I want to dwell on for a second, is through a particular park. I don't know how many people actually know there's the song by the Small Faces, who were kind of pop group in the late 1960s, early 1970s, called Itchycoo Park. Itchycoo Park actually it was a song that was named after the itchy parks of inner East London. Itchy because they were full of tramps with fleas. So Itchycoo Park actually was a song that was written about this particular park and a couple of other parks, which is known now as Alta Valley Park. And the reason I want to kind of go through this is there's a lot of kind of interesting, weird background about this particular place. It's alleged by some of the kind of psychogeographers of London that in this drinking fountain, if you look through the hole, this is an old 12th century construction that you can see down one of the old ley lines of London. But there's also actually the park where the person who executed Charles I is buried in the park. It was an old church that's bombed out, and it's also the site of kind of political gathering in one very small part of East London. Just near here, just near that gate that you see up there, in 1978, in one of the most horrific racist attacks in East London, an old a Jewish garment worker, Bangladeshi rag trade worker, was walking home and was attacked, beaten and killed in one of the most vicious racist killings of the late 1970s. His name was Alta Valley. And the council renamed the park after him to commemorate his death and his murder. So from 1979, the park's been known as Alta Valley Park. Interestingly, every single year, from 1979 through to 2007, the park's name, Alta Valley Park, is painted over by people who resent the renaming of the park after a Bangladeshi garment worker. And each time, every year, the name is put back on again several times. This actually has diminished in the last year or so, but not by much. It's still regularly. So there's a kind of strand of popular racist sentiment that chooses to try and erase the renaming of the park, only for the park to be renamed each time, even now, 27, 28, almost 30 years on from Alta Valley's death. So that kind of erasure and recreation of the park is something that is important. It's also the site where, if you look at maybe better, at the corner of the park, the Bangladeshi community created a memorial, a Shahid Minar. The Shahid Minar you can find in Dhaka, you can find in Oldham, you can find in various spaces of the Bangladeshi diasporic community across the world. It's also, what it is an interestingly kind of modernist structure that commemorates the language markers of 1952. If you think about Bangladesh as a nation, it emerges as a nation from, first of all, the decolonization of the Raj in 48 and the partition of India, the creation of Pakistan East and West as opposed to India, but also out of a set of tensions between West Pakistan and East Pakistan, one of which was the attempted imposition on East Pakistan of Urdu as the lingua franca of the nation, and the emergence of language struggles as being, classically in that Anderson form, a form of national imaginary. The right to speak Bengali became a subject of controversy. And in 1952, a number of people who were language marks were killed in their attempt to push that campaign forward. And that language campaign was seen as one of the grounding moments of the development of a national struggle that culminated in 1971 when Sheikh Mujibur Rahman led the Awami League to political success in East and West Pakistan, but Mujib was toppled and his legitimacy was challenged. And the Bangladeshi national struggle against West Pakistan, as was, became a struggle between the West Pakistan army and East Pakistan resistance, nationalist resistance, but importantly at that time, East Pakistan national resistance was also opposed by Jamaat-e-Islam, Jamaat who owe their political genealogy partly through Muslim Brotherhood, but also the route back to the Gulf. But also the most important point that I want to make in the kind of limited time that we've got is that the struggle for Bangladeshi nationalism is a struggle that is partly against West Pakistan, but it is also partly against Jamaat itself. And at the time in 1971, and there's a lot of documented evidence about this, a large number of people were actually killed by Jamaat, something that is still commemorated today, because of course what happened was in 71 the Indian army intervened, supporting the struggle for Bangladeshi nationalism. And of course both the West Pakistan army were defeated in Bangladesh, but also Jamaat as a political party. And those people who've been involved in the killings, some people talk about the genocide of 71, were themselves forced out of the country. Many of the people, or some of the people at any rate, involved in the events of 71 fled, as people do, from Lenin, Trotsky, Marx, many others over the years, fled to London. And of course, the Bangladeshi community, from 71 to the present day, has been partly a site of debate about the various strands of Bangladeshi nationalism on the one hand and exiled Jamaati politics on the other, with very much the case that in the first generation of politics there was relatively little presence in the main political debate. In the second generation of politics in the 1980s and 90s, the dominant strand of Bangladeshi politics in Britain is secular and is leftist, so that whereas the Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses becomes of enormous controversy globally in the 1980s and in various parts of Britain, Satanic Verses doesn't play as an issue in the East End of London in anything like the same way, because the dominant politics of Bangladeshi diasporic community at that time is secular, is leftist, is not in favour of a rejection of Rushdie's work straightforwardly. But what has occurred over the recent time, particularly since the invasion of Iraq, but also more broadly, I guess, is a third or fourth generation politics that is much more global in its vision, much more explicitly Islamic in its mobilization, and much more explicitly tied to organizations like Jamaat-e-Islam. But the point I want to make is that this is highly contested. So that the organization Public Informer tie into an organization called Nirmal Committee, who challenged that Saidi is a former Jamaati Member of Parliament in Bangladesh more recently, who is a preacher who visits London. But his presence in London has been challenged. And in the same part, this is a protest against Saidi being allowed into the United Kingdom. So there is a debate. The point I'm trying to make is that there is an ongoing debate, a contest about how the notion of Bangladeshi identity, of Islamic identity, is thought about, which reflects the histories of elsewhere, Bangladesh itself, as well as the histories of East London. And the point that I want to make, I guess, is that what happens in recent years is that Respect emerges as a new political party that draws upon a sense of global Islam that is partly about a rejection of second, third generation Bangladeshi politics within the mainstream, but is also drawing upon a particular kind of version of the known local unit, a particular kind of communitarian politics. I want to explain what I mean by that. But very straightforwardly, again, for those of you that are interested in it, I think the fact that there is a tension between the conventional politics of liberalism, I don't mean it in the kind of the pejorative context in which it's used journalistically in both the US and the UK sometimes, but a politics that emphasises human rights, that emphasises the importance of the individual, that emphasises the importance of the ability to debate the political settlement in the here and now, is one that can be inflicted by, there's a liberalism of the left and there is a liberalism of the right. And I think it's something that we sometimes forget, that there is both, that liberalism of the left and the liberalism of the right. But it sits in an uneasy tension with communitarianisms of the left and communitarianisms of the right. And I think what emerges in the ways in which contemporary faith-based politics emerges is they tend to be based on an appeal to community that is very often transnational in the sense that I was just trying to illustrate, but is also highly local. And I just give you one example of this that's particularly famous. Those of you who will know the background of the politics of Texas in the period when your current president was governor, they would be aware of the development of faith-based politics that appeals to the traditions of the IF, the Industrial Areas Foundation, the kind of politics very much inspired by Saul Alinsky, as you know, he's writing the American writer, which tended to try to draw together community politics in ways which made appeals to, if you like, the known local subject. That kind of IAF-type mobilization also works at a transnational level. So that when you see in Texas in the late 80s and 90s, which is exact controlling the dates, but people in the room will know better than I. You see, there's a book by Mark Warren actually called Dry Bones Rattling, where he describes the sorts of communitarian politics that emerge in Texas. He characterizes it in largely positive ways, but the importance is that you have a links between faith-based communities confronting the state in particular ways. That kind of politics has actually been translated internationally, so that those faith-based alliances actually do work together on training programs where the known, what I think we might almost call the global familiar, the neighborhood, the family, certain kinds of moral issues become foregrounded across faiths, and they become quite a powerful way of mobilizing social groups. It means that in London there is a direct connection that is between forms of IAF mobilization around Islam with forms of Christian mobilization in the south in Texas. And people have training links that actually match them up on that cross-international basis. It's also, importantly, that I think, that we understand that parts of these routes, these cultural traffic, there is a debate about the ways in which contemporary Islamism, and I think that itself demands many hours, so I want to be very careful what I say, to kind of recognise how much I don't have time to say around that subject. The debate about Islamic radicalisation in London is partly about the cultural traffic that links various forms of Salafi based practice and ideas from Saudi and the Gulf through London to Bangladesh. So a kind of cultural traffic that links up Saudi Arabia, East London and Bangladesh today through a kind of political transnational imaginary. But also it overlaps, and some of the personnel are exactly the same, with a different kind of cultural traffic about political mobilization about the neighborhood and cross-faith mobilization that links southern churches in the USA to East London in a different form. So these kinds of cultural traffic that are transnational involve exactly the same people. They also involve a particular kind of contest about the multicultural settlement of London. The part of East London that I'm talking about is one where we have seen, in the time in which I've been a politician representing that part of London, 12 years, we've been bombed 7 times. 7 times in 12 years in just that small part of East London. That includes, and I'll get the counting wrong, 4 big IRA bombs. So the IRA ceasefire was broken when Canary Wharf, the Docklands, was bombed. There were 2 big city bombs just down the road from where I live, actually, which right on the edge of the borough, and a 4th major bomb that didn't go off as well in the kind of period of time that was roughly, I guess, 1990 to 1994-ish. That's that sort of period. There was also people in 1999. David Copeland, this man, identified with the far right, chose to blow up, if you like, the iconographic sites of British multiculturalism. He put a bomb in Brixton, the harbour, the Caribbean community in London. He came to Brick Lane in East London, put a nail bomb in Brick Lane. Interestingly, in a kind of moment of East End kind of cultural tradition, somebody saw the smart bag in which this bomb was placed and stole the bomb. They stole the bomb and put it in the boot of their car, the trunk of their car. So what happened was that when they looked at the trunk of their car and realised they'd stolen the bomb, they actually rang the police, and while they were ringing the police, and fortunately, when the bomb went off, it was placed in a crowded street in a very smart training bag. But because somebody had stolen the bomb and put it in the trunk of their car, it exploded in the boot of the car. A lot of property was damaged, and a friend of mine was actually injured not nearly as badly as would have been the case if the bomb had gone off in a crowded street. And thirdly, and most horrifically, he was going to bomb Chinatown in the West End. On his way to Chinatown, he stopped for a drink in what he didn't realise, but in fact was the gay village just to the north of Chinatown, and was so appalled by that particular form of difference, he bombed a pub in the gay village, and horrific deaths resulted, and he was eventually picked up. But those forms of intolerance have been seen on the streets that I live before we had the events of July 2005, when one of the railway stations that was bombed, Aldgate East, was in the East End, again involved horrific killings. But the first suicide bombs that have been seen in London were followed 2 weeks later. The trial that's ongoing at the moment with another set of bombs that didn't go off. Again, one of those was in the East End itself. So there is a kind of, I don't mean this either kind of heroically or in a macabre fashion, but there's been a pattern over the last 15 years of violence that has been based around the multicultural settlement of London. And that violence has been about an intolerance of difference. And what is striking about the people that were bombers, without going into huge detail about it, the horror of the events of the summer of 2005 was when the inevitable suicide videos came out. The important thing I think to remember is that largely these are British kids who are blowing themselves up. British kids speaking in northern accents, very vernacular, strong British accents, from Caribbean and Pakistani backgrounds, but also the victims themselves. The person on the right actually lived at the end of my street. I went to speak to her parents on the days which she was missing before it became clear. I mean, horrifically, she had actually gone to work and been delayed by the explosion of one set of the bombs. People may not know, be aware that one of the bombers was going to go on one particular tube line, and it is believed that this is the case, that was not working, the underground line, and so therefore went on a bus. And so 3 tube lines and a bus were blown up in the 4 suicide bombs in London in 2005. And Shonara actually was delayed going into work, went to King's Cross, couldn't get on the tubes because all the tubes had been shut down because of a bomb, and got on a bus. And horrific, I mean, to the horror of her family was that she'd actually rung her brother after the first bombs had gone off, and said that she was going to go into the West End of London to go shopping, and was killed because she got on the wrong bus. So the point I'm trying to make is that the forms of gross intolerance of difference have multiple routes into London and multiple routes out of London. Part of them connect to a sense of global Islam and a radicalisation around Islam, but they also tie historically to different kinds of nationalism. The nationalism of Ireland in the IRA bombs, the nationalism of the far right in Britain in the British National Party connected bombs of David Copeland. And the point that I want to make is that we need to understand that these contests, these contested versions of the multicultural are happening every day. They're happening every day on the streets of East London. So that when you see street signs like this, where the old postcodes in London, this should be E1, has been carefully painted out to B1, which is Bangor 1. Bangor Town was initially a term of abuse used by the far right about the area around Spitalfields, but was then embraced by people locally and turned on its head, as often with those forms of abuse, into a sense of celebration of Bangor Town. And actually that ward of London is now known as Spitalfields and Bangor Town. This is an old graffiti from one of the street signs, an image I took a while ago. It's also the sense that there is, when you look at the signs of the street, you see a contest of street writing, which is partly around issues of Islam. This particular mural was on the cut. That area is almost a particular kind of public space where kids meet together. There is a debate that is live about football teams, about drugs, about prostitution, but also about politics of left, of right, of Iraq, not Iraq, but also about a certain kind of radicalisation that goes on. And so you have both the mural, a particular kind of hip-hop vernacular, which I think is important to understand in all sorts of ambivalent ways, but also the tag, the neutral zone was here. So the point I'm trying to make is that the radicalisation of young people around Islam is itself contested. And so I want to just begin to finish with the last 5 minutes, about 5 minutes more, is that okay? We're just talking about how that feeds into the events that lead up to 2006 and come back to the place where I started. And the campaign that generated this party called Respect, that drew together Mr. Galloway's interests, the Socialist Worker Party interests, with a particular form of political Islam. I think importantly it mobilised around two things, and what's the argument that I've written some other stuff about academically, which I'm not really dwelling on today, is that both of these represent kind of forms of the global familiar. There was a kind of campaign around the future of social housing in the area. There is a big debate, which I haven't got time to talk about, but whereby we politically were committed to try and generate investment in what's known in Britain as social housing, which is housing rented at subsidised levels, which represented of the 200,000 people that live in this borough. As little as 15, 16 years ago, about 120, 130,000 of those people were living in that social rented housing. A lot of that was bought out under what was known as right-to-buy legislation, where people were allowed to buy their own flats at a discounted rate. But even in the late 1990s, early 2000s, about 40% or more of people were still living in socially rented housing in that area. And to get investment in that housing, which had been mostly built in the period of time in the post-war era, post-45, when this area was very, very badly bombed out, and had been massively underinvested in since. One of the things I was involved with politically was trying to negotiate ways in which you could generate money to invest in this stock. It also involved not-for-profit organisations taking over the ownership of the stock from the local state. Some people suggested this was privatisation, and some people I know and respect different enormously from my own political take on it. My political take on it was that when people were dying in the estate, in the area I represented, in the ward I represented, if you were Bangladeshi and you lived on one of the worst estates in Britain, your life expectation, if you were a Bangladeshi man, was that the average age at death was, and I'll get this wrong, but roughly right, was 57, 58, but was something like 14, 15 years less life expectation than the average age across the country as a whole. Very closely tied to appalling housing conditions. So the kind of political need to try and invest in housing stock, that for me was quite important. But the point was that there was quite legitimately a political campaign against that drive to change housing stock. But it was also a campaign that became very closely identified with the far left. But I think importantly, in terms of the argument I'm trying to make, it tied into a sense of the neighbourhood, that sense of the familiar unit that appealed to that very strong appeal to about people's local neighbourhood. But also the second strand that defined the Respect Party was a sense of global Islam being attacked by the British Army, the American Army in Iraq, and a debate about Israel-Palestine, which I haven't even got time to begin to hint at. The point I'd want to make, though, I think, is that within that debate, the figure of Jewishness, as well as the figure of Christianity in different ways, plays a particular kind of narrative role. I think there is a kind of casual anti-Semitism, frankly, that informs part of that role. Because it defines the political imaginary as being a mobilization of the global Ummah against a certain kind of opposition. And the figure of Jewishness occupies a particular role in those kinds of narratives. Although not, as you can see, the figure of Jewishness alone. So the caricature of Blair as a nun and Bush as a priest, but Blair's decision to kill Muslims and plunder Muslim lands is inspired by God. What will your decision to support his party be inspired by? Makes a particular. This was another leaflet that was distributed in the campaign on the ground last year. There's one, you probably can't see this, but there's a quote in here that says, if you don't want Muslim blood on your hands, don't support the party of war criminals and traitors. You'll be asked on the day of judgment what you did with your vote when you had a chance to punish those who were responsible for killing countless Muslims. Don't be fooled anymore. The point I'm trying to make, in kind of coming back full circle to this, is that we've seen in London a kind of radicalisation that is very powerful. And I think we need to understand where that radicalisation emerges from. And the point that I try and argue is that it actually ties partly to certain histories, in the context of East London in particular, certain histories that link international forms of Salafism through London and to Bangladesh and back again. But also depend on appeals, very emotive appeals, to a certain kind of global familiar, a certain kind of global Ummah, and a certain kind of known neighbourhood that are sentimentally extraordinarily strong, that depend upon narratives of otherness that are about a rejection of otherness, and depend partly upon a narrativization of anti-Semitism as well. But I think what I want to try to suggest is that those forms, including those forms of intolerance, do need to be rooted, literally need to be rooted. And I think that's where I probably differ from some of the arguments that Charles has made. I don't see this, frankly, as a social movement of anti-Semitism as such. What I do see instead is that what emerges is the creation of new kinds of political imaginaries that depend upon certain kinds of otherness reinforcing their stories, certain kinds of hatreds being reproduced. And those kinds of hatreds are, at times, dependent on forms of anti-Semitism, the subject I know is most at the heart of the work here. But I don't think that we can simply say that means that anti-Semitism per se is a social movement. I think what you can say is that we need to kind of map out where these forms of intolerance are emerging from, what are their histories, how are they produced in terms of people's thinking, but also in terms of the relationships between different parts of the world. In the same way, we have seen the growth of a fairly horrific reaction to the bombs of 2005, so that there is on trial at the moment in London a member of the British National Party who has also had stockpiles of explosives that were bought for him by a qualified dentist in the north of England. I mean, that they were basically caught stockpiling a bomb-making factory from the far right. So it is important not to be melodramatic about what is going on, but it is important to understand that that form of intolerance depends upon the creation of Islam as another that is there to be hated. It depends on a naturalization of Huntington's kind of irreconcilable difference between cultures. And so the point I'm trying to make is these different kinds of intolerance have their roots, they have their maps. They partly depend on, if you like, screen capitalism's imaginary, but they also, I think, demand, with some imperative, a response which actually names the coming together of certain kinds of leftism with certain kinds of Islamicism as creating a particular danger at the moment, but also equally demands an understanding and a combating of different kinds of intolerance. The intolerance that we see in Islamophobia, as well as the intolerance we see in anti-Semitism, as well as in the other kinds of intolerance that we've seen too often in London in the last 20 years, and particularly over the last 12 months, I'd say. But I hope that gives you a sense of what's going on.
So Michael, thank you for a really rich presentation. And I'll ask the first question. So I agree strongly that, in a sense, that the intolerance of differences really seems to be maybe one of the core issues, or the core way of labeling some of the problems that we're confronting with globally in terms of identity politics and some of the issues that you mentioned. So my question is, in terms of globalization, you mentioned sort of liberalism versus a communitarian view of society and the debates that happen within both sort of approaches, between the left and the right. And you mentioned screen capitalism. So I was wondering, can you comment on say, the globalization as a process? And I'm thinking of people like Bowman, Zygmunt Bowman, and Castells and David Harvey that look at issues of hybridity and sort of the flip side, or the dark side of globalization, which they comment on how the marginalized groups of globalization are sort of stripped away of political, social, and economic power, and they resort to cultural, or the terrain of culture to resist the onslaught of neoliberal globalization. And that once culture becomes a terrain of struggle, it inherently becomes nostalgic and reactionary and that sort of thing. So structurally, how do we fight the intolerance of difference, which I argue is the social movement of the dispossessed, which is reactionary? How do we deal with the structural inequalities that is creating this disparity? Loosely speaking, that's sort of a progressive way of accepting diversity in cities and diversity in society. So structurally, how do we deal with this phenomenon? And that's one part of the question. And there's a lot you introduced so many amazing ideas. So I'll leave it there. And I'll ask the second.
I mean, first of all, part of what I'm trying to say is that I don't see cultural politics as being, particularly if you talk about people like Castells and Harvey, I would argue, firstly, I don't see cultural politics as being an effect or as a secondary phenomenon as they would. Secondly, that there is something that actually ties to that logic, that you have the big forces of globalization and capital reorganization, and then what gets determined as an afterthought or is as an effect is a residuum of identity politics or cultural politics that is by that logic, necessarily backward. And Castells talks about this in his work, which I think is very powerful in lots of ways. But identity politics becomes almost a something that is backward by its very nature. And I think that's wrong precisely because it doesn't get to grips with some things that we all want, which are sometimes incommensurable. It comes back. I know this sounds a very trite or simplistic way to describe it, but when we think about the city, there is a way of thinking about the city of modernity, the city of the 20th century, as being profoundly liberating, precisely because it values anonymity, it values the presence of the stranger, it values the fact that people can live together in situations where their relationships to each other are not determined by their family, by their skin colour, by the various kinds of known relationship. They are citizens in a particular space. And that kind of writing that values the anonymity of the city, that values the rights of the city, sits in quite a strong tension with the kinds of writing that quite often we might like as well, that tends to value the cherished and known spaces of community. So writers like Jane Jacobs, talking about New York many years ago in Greenwich Village, would talk about the value of the spirit of community, the history of community in that particular part of town. But that spirit of community, which is partly about the fact that crime levels are low because everybody knows each other and looks at each other, is partly contrary to the fact that the knowing and looking and nosiness of community is partly about the suppression of difference, whether it's the emergence of gay communities or Marshall Berman, who writes a fantastic book called Solid Melts into Air, and talks about the problem with Jane Jacobs being that her Greenwich Village that she cherishes so much, and the city of New York that she cherishes so much, is the city before the black folk get there. So we have to understand that there is a tension between the city as known and the city as a space of freedom. And the way that then emerges, I think in the 21st century, there is a different kind of version of this that is also precisely about the extent to which we manage different kinds of difference in the spaces of London or New York or Los Angeles or Shanghai for that matter, which do tie in tensions between certain kinds of global familiar. As you say, Islam is I think one example, but I think we will see the emergence of many more over the years, which I think means that cultural politics is going to be part of the determining of what happens, rather than just an effect of economic globalization, is what I'm trying to say. Sorry.
I had a question about the specifics of your borough and your election. You explained the feeling against the Labour Party because of their politics, which isn't a particularly Semitic party, against the IRA that was violent toward them, toward the ultranationalists that was violent toward them, and a diminishing elderly Jewish population. What would be the roots, the specific local roots of anti-Semitism then, when all their opposition really weren't Semitic, it seems to me?
I'm sorry, I may have given the description slightly right. I wasn't saying, you see, what I was saying is that anti-Semitism has been rooted through the East End, but not all of the intolerance of difference or the violence is attributed to anti-Semitism per se. Just to give you two examples, that the people often talk journalistically now about the White East End, and it's actually a very foreshortened historical memory that can talk about it. People will probably remember the character Archie Bunker. Archie Bunker was based on a character called Alf Garnett. Alf Garnett lived in Wapping, and he was kind of part of the kind of caricature of White East Ender who was intolerant and racist in the 1960s. And the White East End is quite often talked about unproblematically when it really contains these very different traditions, the Irish tradition, Jewish tradition, all in that part of London. So the area As it happens, my family, my mum was born, and my grandfather was a policeman in the Wapping area, which is still Catholic, excuse me. And it covers that the Catholic Irish bit is still there, but also they're getting old and moving on, although you probably say this even on camera, but the crime family that controls Wapping is still Irish. And so there are old traces that remain. The point is the IRA bombs weren't against the Jewish community. I think they were a form of nationalism.
No, I'm talking about the Bangladesh feeling against that somehow there's a root of it. If it's all going to be historical, we're in deep trouble.
No, you see, that's what I'm trying to say. It's partly about a new, the quote that I gave is that there is a new way of imagining ourselves that doesn't just fit within a nation, that is multiple, that sees ourselves being both very local, but also part of a broader global community. I think what I'm trying to say is that certain strands of anti-Semitism actually do fit within new ways of narrating oneself in the world, but they're just part of a bigger story as well. And I think the nail bomber who also bombed Brick Lane is the bomb that was nicked, but was actually, he bombed the Caribbean community in Brixton, as well as the Bangladeshi community in Brick Lane, the Chinese community in Chinatown, and ended up in the gay pub. I mean, that was a particular. The point I'm trying to make is that the forms of intolerance have been many in their origin and many in their target. But we have to understand where that intolerance is coming from in the 21st century. But sorry.
I also have a question specifically about your borough. You mentioned that the third, fourth generation Bangladeshis have rejected the secular leftist plot lines and have now turned to more radical, or not even radical, but more religious understanding of themselves.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about what were the local grievances that led to that change? Why did they not just continue on? Because I assume you don't want to make the case that it's just because of global influences that they've turned away.
No, absolutely. I think it's hard to give a single, a single story because part of the second, third generations politics was partly evinced through a very successful machine, an old style, almost kind of Chicago daily style political machine that was I was complicit in or part of in some senses, that generated political control and without going, I could spend a lot of time giving numbers and facts and figures and personalities, but basically a secular left machine that included friends of mine that used to go, after 10 o'clock you'd go drinking in the pub and playing cards and gambling, which I probably shouldn't have done, but that's what we did, which was largely Bangladeshi, took control of the borough largely, in alliance with kind of, I guess, people like myself who are kind of the left and mostly of the voluntary sector as well. And were in some senses seen to deliver along a certain kind of agenda. So there were enormous improvements in education, enormous improvements in welfare support. At the same time, I think what was the case was that many of that generation began to move on, and move out and get on. Many of the bits of the machine, I think, became rotten in particular ways. Some bits of the machine seemed to be corrupt, not the whole machine itself. There was also a sense of growing debate about the way in which that machine was seen to deliver nationally, as in, it was addressing local debates fairly effectively, but at a time when the issues around the war in Iraq became increasingly significant in the beginning of the 21st century, but also going back before then. What had happened was that whereas, as I say, the Rushdie affair never played in the 1980s in the East End, what did happen quite systematically was that a number of organisations started addressing the needs of young people at a very early a very early stage in the 1990s. I did a piece of research in the 1990s which interviewed people where some young men in that area quite close to where the graffiti was, who were involved in very violent youth, Bangladeshi violence with people being hurt very badly, but also where drugs, crack cocaine, rips through the community at incredible speed as it does in many parts of the world. Who goes and fights that? Well, the political machine, kind of grown old and occupied positions of power. Who's there on the street at that particular time? Young Muslim organisation organises, but also informal. One of the people I know who's a kind of flawed person I've interviewed several times with an academic hat on, was very violent, involved in some things I shouldn't even say, but some pretty horrific stuff. Finds God, finds faith, and in finding faith he finds a certain kind of Islam and starts, in his case, he started kidnapping kids and making them go cold turkey while he was reading the Quran. And so Islam becomes a kind of radicalisation on the street that ties into some fairly grim socio-economic realities that are still going on, notwithstanding some of the good things that the Bangladeshi machine is delivering. So the Bangladeshi machine become the establishment. Those people that see the establishment as not good enough are increasingly attracted by a number of people who are increasingly radical. At the same time, the distance from 1971 grows. So there is a generation still that is present that are mostly old men now in their 50s and 60s that will have absolutely nothing to do with Jamaat or the politics of Jamaat. Even though I'm not, I've got to be careful what I'm saying. There's a debate about the extent to which the politics of Jamaat ties into the politics of July, the suicide, or does or doesn't tie into the ultra-radicalization agenda. But the point that I make is that the growing Islamization of some of the young people is in very much a kind of generational sense, something that some of the people who are now in their 50s or 60s see as being deeply troubling because of what happened in Bangladesh in 71. So the distance from 71 to 2007 gets played in very different ways according to where you stand personally, what your life chances are in terms of whether you're a kid caught up in the street in the drugs wars or the gang wars, which have involved guns and knives and all sorts of politics around that sort of stuff, as well as debates around what's happening in Palestine, Israel, Iraq, Iran, and so on. So there is a debate that is simultaneously about what's happening over there and what's happening very much here, going on at the same time.
Thanks.
That's sort of, sorry. Thank you.
One thought I have about listening to you is that, there are, it's almost impossible to have a well-mixed community that will sustain itself as well-mixed over a substantial period of time. I'm thinking of some of the work that Tom Schelling did years ago, where you take two groups and you basically give them very simple preferences, which is, I just want to be in a place where I'm a simple majority. Not that I'm in a neighborhood that is overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly black, overwhelmingly Jewish, but I just want there to be one more. And then the question is, what happens? What patterns emerge if you have people who just sort of have the same preferences? And what happens is you basically get segregation type patterns. So while you can go back and say, the specific history gives rise to these concentrations of people in different places and so on, it's actually so fragile that even without that, it seems to me, you'd still end up with sort of birds of a feather, as it were, like living with like. And so that's the first part of the observation. And the second thing is, I think what's really different recently, as opposed to the past, is what I can't remember the writer who used the term, but the screen capitalism idea, that the fact that information is everywhere simultaneously, that's actually new. That's something that wasn't always around. And so what happens is you now live in a world where you can kind of say, well, if I happen to be in this town, I can be in this part of town, which is my kind of place. And if I go to New York, if I go to Paris, if I go to London, if I go to Brisbane, I can always find the right part of town to go to, which is sort of the same type of place for me. And you see the same, you get the same information, you get the same, you kind of get the same input to how the world looks. It doesn't matter where you are, So it just seems that in that kind of an environment, it's a lot easier to to sort of start people off moving in one direction or another, and it seems like that's one of the things that happened here. I mean, is this possible to really concentrate the information in this respect campaign, pick on a couple of themes, you know, really fuel the situation with the information from the Middle East that you were suggesting? I guess what I'm worried about is that because if the only way to explain what's happening is you go to every city and say, well, there's all these unique circumstances there, then in a sense, in a way, it's not really an explanation. It's a description of what happened in that place. And what I'm suggesting is that
Christian Islamic groups came together to reject the presence of the British National Party. So it is a site historically of both moments of great despair and moments of transcendence of that despair. And I guess part of the context I wanted to talk about today is one where, if you like, to give away the strapline and then hopefully justify it a little bit, it's one where I think it is important to understand the genesis, the genealogy, the cartography, the maps, the routes of forms of intolerance that cross a variety of religious faiths, that include anti-Semitism, that include forms of Islamophobia, that include forms of faith hate that cross just about each religion, and to understand where they're coming from, but also to understand those political imaginaries in the context of other geopolitics. And so part of the point I'm trying to make, I guess, is that we need a quite careful scrutiny of the genesis of forms of intolerance in order to neither oversimplify their production, nor, if you like, reproduce sometimes their binary and simplistic Manichaean, Schmittian thinking in particular ways. However, I wanted to start the talk. There's a reality show on which covers most endemol production, sell it to most countries in the world. I don't think they've yet sold it to the USA, so I assume many people will not have heard of it. It's a program called Big Brother. Big Brother is a reality TV show where people can find the first version of segregation in London that people don't talk about very often. The first model of apartheid was when King Alfred recaptured the city from the Danes, and the Danes were banished to the east of the River Lee. So on one side you had the Danes, and the other side you had the Angles, as was. But it contains both the New Docklands, the financial district on the Isle of Dogs, which has now is the second largest financial district in Europe in its own terms, has about 100,000, getting on for 150,000 jobs in the financial services. It also contains some of the most broke parts of the United Kingdom, some of the most intense concentrations of poverty. It's remarkable both for its forms and history of exclusion, but also for the moments at which those forms of exclusion have been challenged. Historically, the East End is where Oswald Mosley from the British Union of Fascists chose to march in the 1930s. But it's also where communities of difference came together, Irish, Jewish, Caribbean, among others, among many others actually, to oppose Mosley. And Mosley's march through Cable Street was famously turned away under the slogan, "They shall not pass." It's the place where in the 1980s the first far-right fascist councillor from the British National Party, was elected in 1993, the first successful representation of that in democratic electoral politics of the British National Party. But it's also where, again, a coalition of Bangladeshi, white, Jewish, to a house for a period of a few weeks or a month or 2 months in some cases, and then all of their movements are scrutinised. It's a fairly horrific form of entertainment. It started in the Netherlands, it crosses, there are versions of this in Australia, in Brazil, in most countries in the world. One version of it in the United Kingdom is a version of Celebrity Big Brother. George Galloway, a politician, how many people here have heard of George Galloway? And I'll explain Mr. Galloway in a little bit more detail. Galloway is somebody who was a politician on the Labour left, who sometimes was on the Labour right, came out of the Scottish context, which was marked by a particular politics in the Scottish Labour Party around tensions between Catholic and Protestant, interestingly, but also was involved in the early stages of an NGO called War on Want that he ran, and was involved in a policy around War on Want and the finances of it before he became a controversial MP. He left the Labour Party, was expelled from the Labour Party due to his position on his response to the Iraq War, principally, but also after a history of disputes with the party. He has been identified and alleged to have been a recipient of. Thank you, Charles, and thank you for the invitation. Just to introduce the talk itself, Charles asked me today to talk a little bit about what's been happening in London from a biographical perspective, which is why this isn't a straightforward academic paper. It's a paper that is, if you like, a collision between one part of my life, which is my political career, and another part of my life, which is an academic career. And if you like, the academic interests are the shadow throughout the story that I'm going to tell over about 40 minutes. To give you a little bit of background to the political context which I'm talking about is that inner London, one part of London immediately to the east. London has 32 boroughs. Each borough is responsible for schooling, for planning, for development, for health, has a degree of control over policing. It represents roughly about £1 billion a year organisation. That's about $2 billion a year. And of those 32 boroughs, the borough I was responsible for 5 years and was a representative of for 12 years in various other roles, is the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, immediately to the east of the City of London. It runs from Whitechapel, Brick Lane, the old Jewish ghetto of London, through across to the River Lee, where interestingly
Director of the Centre for Urban and Community Research at Goldsmiths College at the University of London. And he's a former colleague of mine from Goldsmiths, and we actually studied with the same supervisor at Oxford, so it's really nice that Michael's here today. His research interest focuses on issues of representation in the city in relation to urban policy, race and racism, and issues of policing. His publications include a book called Race, Riots and Policing, Law and Disorder in a Multi-Racist Society, which was published by UCL. And he edited a collection of essays called Place and the Politics of Identity from Routledge, Racism, the City and the State, also from Routledge, and Hallowed Promises, Rhetoric and the Reality of the Inner City by Castles in 1990. He edited with Stephen Pyle Geographies of Resistance from Routledge in 1997, which was an important book in social and cultural geography. He's also, among many other things, the co-director of the Deptford City Challenge project in the southeastern part of London. He's doing major research projects and development projects in China. He was also, as you'll see in the presentation, I'm sure today, the head of Tower Hamlets, the Labour head of Tower Hamlets, which is in the eastern part of London. So Michael will speak today. The title of his talk is Geopolitics on the Street, Transnationalism, the Political Imagery, and a Personal Account of contemporary London elections.